This is probably the most under talked about yet most impactful geopolitical situation that's going on in the world right now. Nobody's talking about it except Peter Zion. I think he's the smartest geopolitics expert in the world today. So listen to what he has to say here about age demographics, the role they play in a country, society, economy, and the disastrous situation that China is in with its age demographics. Video quality might be a little choppy, but the audio is fine. It's because my software is acting up. So support the independent forum if you want to help fix that. Links in the description. And I'm going to be popping in and out because, again, the software won't let me screen record and record myself at the same time. So working around it. And here we go.
Demographics are about how population structures stack up. So children versus young adults versus mature adults versus retirees. And the normal program is, it looks a little bit like a pyramid with very few retirees at the top and a lot of children down below and everyone stacked up in between.
Here's a quick chart of the India age demographics to show what he's talking about with that pyramid description.
And when you have a normal demographic like that, it's going to be relatively inflationary because all those people who are age 45 and under, the adults are doing all kinds of consuming. They're raising their kids, they're buying their homes, they're going to college, they're spending, building up their lives.
An example of this is the inflation that was taking place during the 1970s, because that's when the baby boomers were peaking in this peak spending age that he's talking about. And that combined with the oil crisis in the 70s, so that didn't help.
And then, of course, anyone who's under 18 is a net beneficiary of that, and that costs money too, to feed and clothe and educate children. So that is where most of the economic activity in most society comes from, people aged 45 and under. Now, once you get to roughly age 40, 42, 65, the kids are moving out, the house has been paid down, and you're in the process of preparing for your retirement. And so your expenses might not be all that much. And in that sort of environment, you're not consuming very much, but you have, lots of money. And that's a different economic model because you literally have decades of experience behind you. You're a very productive worker, but at the end of the day, you're not buying all that much. So all of that money goes into the system. This is the bond market. This is the stock market. This is international investment. This is what drives the investment side of the consumption and investment equation. And then after you turn 65, you retire. You liquidate all of your savings. You go into very boring investments. And at that point, you kind of retire from the system completely, literally and figuratively. Now that's a normal pyramid, but it's all about the stuff at the bottom that drives it because that's the biggest chunk of the population. Well, what we have seen in the days of industrialization and urbanization, especially after World War II, is child mortality has dropped almost to zero. It used to be that upwards of half of all kids died before age 5. Now it's very, very few at all. At the same time that health has improved, and so people are living longer. And so this pyramid, as the children have survived and people have lived longer, it's opened up and it's become kind of a chimney.
Here's a quick chart of the U.S. age demographics, creating that funnel shape that he's talking about, as baby boomers at the top, millennials are at the bottom. Now millennials are the largest age demographic in the world, in the U.S. today. So we got the funnel shape going. Not a terrible place to be in.
And for most modern economic systems, this has been what has defined us for the last 70 years. And in that sort of environment, it's a very different system. In a chimneyed economic model, you have about the same number of children versus young adults versus mature adults. And that gives you a balanced economic structure that we're all familiar with because it's all what we've been living through. But historically speaking, it's relatively atypical. So inflation is broadly under control because there are still a lot of young people, but they're not the dominant group. And there's a lot of capital because you've got all those mature workers up top, but it's not like it's distortionary. So you don't get a lot of bubbles. You don't get a lot of inflation. You've got a balance between consumption and production. And we think of this as normal. It's not. It's just a moment in time because we keep aging. As the birth rate keeps dropping, the bottom starts to narrow. And as lifespans keep expanding, that top gets wider and wider. And eventually we get an inverted pyramid.
And now here's that inverted pyramid that he's talking about with China, the dreaded inverted pyramid. You're going to hear why that's such a bad spot to be in and why China got there.
And what we're seeing in a lot of places like in East Asia and Europe is this is now their dominant pattern, where you've got more people in their 50s and their 40s and their 30s and their 20s and their teens. And in that sort of environment, things get kind of weird. Because when you run out of people below age 40, a lot of that consumption simply goes away. Even worse, you now have a lot of people who are approaching retirement, so they're very capital rich, and that's now your dominant group. So very productive workforce, no hope at all that they could possibly consume everything they build. Now, if you want to avoid this sort of future, there are really only two things you can do. Number one, you can get your birth rate back up. And if you're still in that chimney position, you can probably pull that off. But once you've gone inverted, you no longer have enough people aged under 40 to even theoretically try. The other thing you can do is borrow other people's kids and implement a massive immigration policy in order to bring people in their millions to round up your own population.
That's why I always yell at people when they say the world's overpopulated. No, the world's not overpopulated. We have a demographic problem potentially if people don't start having kids on a more frequent basis. But of course, we need better policy making to create situations where people want to have more kids because they feel more confident about the future. Again, immigration to the U.S. is not a bad thing at all. Just disorganized immigration is a bad thing where people aren't accounted for when they come over. I think that we should focus on making immigration easier and easier to keep track of. But that's a discussion for a different day. So in this video, he goes into the problems that China is facing with their age demographics and what it's going to lead to.
These now have birth rates that are below 0.7, making it impossible for them to maintain their population at all. That means, just from this one statistic, China is already the fastest aging society in human history. The second big number is that China's population peaked last year, in fact, with the population dropping by about 800,000 people. The scary thing about both of these figures is that we know they're wrong. A couple years ago, the Chinese started releasing bits and pieces out of their 2020 decade census, and they came to the grudging and public admission that they had overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, with all of those missing millions having been born since the one-child policy was adopted 40 years ago. So we're talking about exclusively these 100 million people or so are people who would have been aged 40 or under, the folks who have the kids. You combine that with the birth rate information, and we are looking at the complete dissolution of the Chinese demography in a very short period of time. Because if you're losing a lot of people, or you've never had a lot of people under age 40, that suggests that the ability of the Chinese system to maintain a workforce and a tax base is dissolving before our eyes. And we've never seen a system anytime in history that's been able to make it through this sort of transition without a massive, massive, massive change in the political and economic environment. And the possible changes the Chinese are about to experience are not what I would consider things that will make this work better.
Think about what he just said. This has never happened before in human history, and nobody's talking about it. Everybody's still thinking China's this giant threat, but the only thing they're a threat to is themselves.
The problem is that the Chinese model, economic model, is completely dependent upon globalization and internationalization. This is a country that imports 75 to 80% of their oil. This is the world's largest importer of food. This is a country whose oil comes primarily from the Persian Gulf, which is no longer being patrolled by anyone with a navy. And this is a country whose economic model is utterly dependent upon the ability to import raw materials and tech and then export semi-finished and finished goods to other markets that are in a different hemisphere for the most part, or at least a different continent. None of this works unless everyone gets along. And China has seen its economic and political relations with every single trading partner bottom out, with the exception, of course, with the Russians, because there's a shared love of genocide there. So a couple things. First, to a degree, we've always known that this was coming. In addition to the one-child policy, the Chinese have been the fastest urbanizing country in human history. And when you move off the farm and into the city, kids become a bit of a luxury good as opposed to free labor, so everyone has fewer of them. And the fact that urbanization happened at the same time as the one-child policy just crunched down the birth rate even more. We've now seen the birth rate officially, by the numbers that are probably over-optimistic, fall by more than 60% in just the last 6 years. And this is to a degree expected, because when the birth rate is low for long enough, eventually, 30, 40 years on, it cuts into the number of people who are having the children in the first place. So if you have a smaller generation with a much lower birth rate, you get a catastrophically lower birth rate, and that's exactly where we are right now, and this will not get better unless we figure out human cloning at scale. Second is the issue of timing. At the rate of degradation, there will have never been a country we already have never had a country in human history in this sort of situation, but we don't even have an economic theory for how an economy might function if this Chinese data continues on its current path for just another 8 years. So 2030 is probably the use-by date if it doesn't break sooner. And that assumes nothing else goes wrong in the Chinese system. Nothing with agriculture, nothing with trade, nothing with finance, nothing with the Americans, nothing with energy.
This is exactly why I always say China needs the U.S. more than we need them. It's not even close. Yes, it would hurt us if tensions arise. We'd have shortages in certain material goods, but with actual raw commodities like food and oil, they'd be decimated. So as you can see, the situation they're facing is a perpetual doom loop. Here's a great visual of a simulation of what their age demographics are going to look like over the next 100 years. So I hope with all this information, anybody who's worried about China being an actual threat to the U.S., I hope we was able to wash those opinions away. Yeah, we have a ton of problems here, but just like inflation, by contrast or by comparison with other countries, we're still doing much better. Hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. Join the Independent Forum. Check out the Conspiracy Court podcast. And I'll see you soon. Peace.